Okay, well, good afternoon. My name is Mark Wagner. I am a professor at SIU Carbondale. I'm both an archaeologist and a historian. And one of my major research interests has always been, for the past 40 years, has been Native American rock art, which are paintings and carvings. And we have a lot of them in Illinois and in the other states in the East, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. Illinois actually has the first reported rock art site in the eastern United States, and that is what this first slide is showing you. It is the Piasaw bird. It was located at Alton, Illinois, and it was this big mythical creature painted on the rock face. And it existed until 1856 when it was destroyed by quarrying. So it's our first known site. It's also our first known destroyed site. And you can see in the picture here what it's showing you. There are Indians and they're shooting at the rock face. This is an 1850s lithograph. And I can guarantee you no Indian ever shot at that creature because it is a powerful spirit being. And the last thing they would have done was shoot at it because they would have been scared of what would have happened to them. But it did have thousands of bullet holes in it. And I suspect that's more from river travelers going up and down. And it persisted until the 1850s when it was destroyed. Now, the Piasaw bird is a creature, and I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, that's common in Native American religion. So this was a religious image. And it's a very dangerous creature. It's got elements that associate it with water. It had like a fish tail. It had elements that associate it with the world that we live on. It had deer antlers. And at some times it had wings. Various people would say it had wings. And sometimes you could see them and sometimes you couldn't. This is an experience I've had with rock art. Sometimes because of lighting or humidity, certain elements are visible and other times you can't see them. So the Piasaw was one of these dangerous spirit beings from Native American religion. And we have no idea how old it was. I think it was created over 1,000 years ago. We do have paintings from that period that still survive in Illinois. So there's no reason a big prehistoric painting created by people at Cahokia, which is the big Mississippian center to the south, couldn't have survived for 1,000 years. The next reported site that we have also no longer exists is one that relates more to this area down here in the lower Ohio Valley. When some British soldiers were going down the Ohio River in the 1760s, one of the places they stopped was Cave-in Rock. Everybody in the 19th century stopped at Cave-in Rock. Every river traveler stopped there. It's just such an impressive place. And the British soldiers went in. They were part of the Black Watch. They were on their way to take over Illinois from the French, who had lost it in the French and Indian War. And they stopped in the cave, and their commanding officer reported that there were all sorts of Indian signs and drawings on the wall in Cave-in Rock. And you go to Cave-in Rock today and none of that exists anymore. And part of the reason is that by the turn of 1900, the walls had been completely covered with graffiti. And the state of Illinois during the 1930s, WPA, Civilian Conservation Corps projects, actually went in and cleaned the walls of the cave, having no idea that there was anything underneath. So we really, except for this one officer's account, we have no idea of what was in Cave-in Rock, except we know something was there. And I wanted to talk very quickly about ritual sites and landscapes, because this is something, when I talk about rock art, it's why is it created? And something I'd like to get across is it's not doodling on the rock face. It's not drawing. People aren't mindlessly doing this. It's not graffiti. Native Americans are doing it for religious purposes. These are ritual sites as part of a bigger religious landscape. And what they're doing, and we do the same thing today. They have both natural and man-made sites that are religious. And if you look at this slide, we've got an example of Mount Ararat, which is where Noah's Ark supposedly ended up. And it's religious, it's important to several different religions. But you go out there today and there's nothing there except the mountain itself. And then you've got the Grotto of Lourdes in France, which also is a spring that supposedly has miraculous healing powers because of the Virgin Mary, but it's only important because we say it is. So you've got these natural sites that are being given spiritual power, but then you can also create ritual sites. And examples would be the pyramids. When we create a cemetery becomes a ritual site. And other man-made sites or human-made sites are rock art sites, and they are being created for religious purposes by people who live elsewhere. And most of the rock art in Illinois is religious in nature, and the majority of it is created during the Mississippian period. And this is 1000 to 1500 AD, and this is when in Eastern North America, Indian society gets the most complex. They have large populations, they're living in fortified towns, they have leaders that are both political leaders and priests at the same time, so they're like sun kings. And the biggest one, of course, is Cahokia, which is in Illinois. And it is actually considered to be America's first city. But what you get are people at these ritual sites, at these big Mississippian centers, are engaging in all sorts of rituals, because these are also religious sites. The person who leads whatever settlement you're in, whatever town you're in, is also a religious leader. So they're doing all sorts of ceremonies to validate their power at these centers, but at the same time, they're also going out on the landscape, and they're holding different sorts of ceremonies and rituals, and part of what they're doing is creating rock art. And the reason we know so much about Mississippian religion is because of these two men. One of them is very early. He's a man named John Swanton in the 1920s, and Swanton went out and interviewed all the Native Americans, recorded all the myths and legends about how their societies were structured, what their religion was like. And then in the 1970s, there was another historian named Charles Hudson, who did the same thing. And he wrote a book on the Southeastern Indians, which talks about all this, talks about how important religion was to them, how important ritual was to them. And so what you get, and this is coming out of the work of Swanton and Hudson, is that Southeastern Indians believed in a universe that had three layers. It had the level that we lived on, which is Earth, where all the plants and animals and people live. But above us is an upper world, where there are giant mythical beings that live in the upper world. And below us is the underworld. And the underworld is a place of fertility. But there are also powerful creatures that live in the underworld, like the underwater panther and the horned serpent. And what you're seeing in this image here is, I think actually shows like a cave in the center, and where you can enter into, and you can go down into the underworld, or the horned serpent can come up into this world. And so the Southeastern Indians believed in balance. You had to keep these three parts of the universe in balance, and when they weren't in balance, things got very dangerous. And there were powerful creatures that you had to placate, which were like the horned serpent in the underworld, and these powerful spirit beings in the upper world. And their idea is not too hard to understand. If you just think about, this is common all over the world. If you think about like Christian religion, although this is not related to Christian religion, we have an upper world where angels live and God lives. We have a world that we live on. And then we have an underworld where the devil lives. So we have the same sort of idea of three levels, similar to what they had. And this brings me back to the Piasa. The Piasa was seen by Marquette and Joliet when they were coming down the Mississippi River, the first explorers in Illinois to leave any sort of written records. And they saw it at 1678 at Alton. And this is the top image, the one on the left here, is actually from a French map, and it's based on their account. And this is much more accurate than other drawings you see later on. But you can see the big serpent or fish tail this thing has got. You can see it's got the antlers on its head, and it's got a mammal type body. And so this is what the Piasa actually looked like. And when you think about Native American religion, this is what it is. It's one of these underworld creatures that they're portraying on the rock face. And why there? Why are they putting it there? Why do they believe it lived there? Well, this is where the Illinois in the Mississippi come together, and there were very dangerous rapids that you could wreck your canoes and wreck your boats in. And Marquette and Joliet talk about these. And their paddlers, who were Illini Indians, were scared of those rapids. So one of the things, this sort of image is showing you, this is the creature that lives in those rapids. And that is what that is supposed to portray. Now I'm going to use some terms when I talk today. These are just some real basic terms, and some of them are obvious. I'll talk about a petroglyph. All a petroglyph is, it's anything that's carved into the stone, where somebody has taken another rock and they've either pecked or ground into the stone. A pictograph is anything that's painted on the rock face. And surprisingly enough, we have a lot of pictographs in Illinois that are over 1,000 years old that still survive. And we have both red and black paintings. Another term I use is anthropomorph. And all that means is human-like. We see lots of pictures of little people on the landscape. We don't know if these are people. We know they're human-like. They look like people, but they could be some sort of spirit beings. So it's easier just to call them anthropomorphs, which just means people-like. And then we have a motif. And a motif is a particular design, like a very popular one during the Mississippian period is a cross and a circle, which symbolizes the universe in the four directions. And these are examples of pictographs in Illinois. All of these are in southern Illinois. They're all red paintings. You can see one at the top left is, it's like a human archer is in conflict with another person who's holding a shield up in front of them. If they're people, again, they're anthropomorphs. We don't know if these are people. These could be mythical figures in a myth. In the center is a canoe image. And I found this about 30 years ago at a rock art site in Illinois, which I'm going to show in a little bit, which is open to the public and you can go visit. But until we did that work, no one ever knew that there were canoe paintings in Illinois. And it's a very small painting. It's only about 6 inches long. And it shows a canoe with about 6 or 7 people sitting in it. Other things you get are hand paintings where people are putting pigment on their hands and pressing them against the rock face. And you also get other sort of designs. At the bottom is a huge circle with a dot in the center of it. What they make the paintings out of, and I'm going to show you how we know this in a little bit. The paintings in Illinois are by and large, the red paintings are all made out of iron oxide. They find hematite or iron ore and they grind it up and they mix it with something to hold it to the rock face. So when you analyze these paintings, all you're going to find out in most cases is that they're made out of iron ore. But we also have charcoal paintings, charcoal drawings that are made with charcoal in the state. And those are our two main sorts of pictographs that we have. And these are the images we see. These are all petroglyphs. And you can see they're not all human figures. At the top we've got something that we call an avomorph. And all that means is it's a bird-like image. It looks like it's part human and part bird. It's got human-like legs, but instead of arms, it's got wings. So it's not anything, it's not an animal, it's not a person, it's some sort of mythical creature. In the center, there are a group of little anthropomorphs. And they're human-like, except some of them have heads that just end in cones. So they may not be people either. But an interesting thing about rock art is we get information from rock art that we don't get anywhere else. And if you look at those little figures in the center, one of them right above the scale is holding out something rectangular at the end of his arm. And what's a shield? And all the archaeology that has been done in this state, we have never found a shield. And going back for a second, in the pictographs in that one in the upper left, you see the one figure is holding up a shield. Again, archaeology has been done in this state for over 100 years. We have never, ever found a fragment of a shield. Yet we look at these carvings, we look at these paintings, we see people or mythical beings holding shields. So they had them. They just haven't survived. Down at the bottom is this is an image you can go see. This is at Millstone Bluff on land owned by the Shawnee National Forest. It is a piosaur image. It is a snake body, but it's got elk antlers on its head. So it's another one of these composite spirit beings associated with the underworld. How old is our rock art? we really don't know how far it goes back in time. We do know that we have Mississippian era paintings, which means that it goes back 1,000 years. But there was an not an archaeologist, there was a rock art researcher who worked here in Kentucky named Fred Coy. And Fred worked from the 50s on up until his death about 10 years ago. And Fred was convinced that rock art goes back several thousand years in the East. And one of the earliest designs you see are human footprints. And Fred thought that because he would often find them in rock shoulders with like grinding holes and archaic tools. And I think he's right. And then in other parts of the country in the East, we actually have some rock art that has been dated in caves that goes back to the Archaic period. And that's 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. So we know people in the East have been producing art for 3,000 to 5,000 years. Most of the oldest art is preserved in caves, other places, but we do get paintings that survive in the open air. As to where our rock art is in Illinois, these are the regions. Essentially, it's anywhere that you've got rock, you are going to have rock art. A lot of most of the recorded sites are in southern Illinois. That's because that's where I work, and that's where other rock art researchers before me have worked. So most of the recorded sites are down in deep southern Illinois. But there are also sites up in the Illinois River Valley, on the Mississippi Valley, where the Piasaw bird was, and even as far north as up in Will County. There is a little small cave up in Will County, up by Chicago, that has a painting in it. But we also have sections of the state that have no recorded rock art. And in this one, you can see the far northwest end of the state at the very top left-hand corner. That's the driftless region. And we have no recorded rock art sites in it. But a man working across the state line in Wisconsin, over 20 years ago, he had recorded 150 rock art sites in the exact same physical province, the driftless region. So what that lets us know is that we've got hundreds of sites out there that we don't know about because people either aren't looking for them or they see them and they don't recognize them for what they are and they don't get reported. So how many sites do we have? I would say we have in Illinois, we have over 100 recorded sites. I think the actual number of sites that still have survived is probably in the thousands somewhere. And the problem is a lot of them are little tiny images. And you have to know what you're looking for, and you have to be there at the right time, on the right day, when the light is right, when it's not raining, and you'll see them. Other times, if you're there on the wrong day, you won't see them. And this is where our sites occur down in southern Illinois. And why we have so much rock art, we have two major rock-controlled physical divisions. We have the Ozarks, and we have the Shawnee Hills. And inside of these, this is where we get rock art inside of them. We get it high up on bluff faces. We get it on rock outcrops. We get it in rock shoulders, which are small caves that go into the rock face. And we get it on the bedrock out in the open. And on the far right, in the upper right, there is an image of a rock art site. This one is on private property. And that one was done back in the 50s. And it's a series of human footprints as if people are facing each other. And the reason that they're white is that the SIU Museum at that time, back in the 50s, was making plaster casts of them. That's why they show up like that. They're not actually white if you go to see them. Directly below them is another one of these footprint sites, but unlike the one above it, it is has been terribly vandalized and damaged and wrecked over the years. And I'm going to talk about that later on, which is why we actively have to protect rock art. There are people out there who damage it and destroy it. This is where most of our rock art begins. It begins in the Archaic period, about 8,000 years ago. And this is a time period when people have not yet learned how to, it's a pre-agricultural age. They get most of their food through hunting and gathering. And as time goes on through the Archaic period, the beginnings of agriculture start to happen. And the art we see from this time period relates to the way they live. We see lots of these deep mortar holes in the bedrock where they are grinding up nuts and seeds. And as a result of the process they're doing it, They've got like a big mortar and they're pounding on the rock. They end up driving these big cylindrical mortars holes into the bedrock. And they also occur here in Kentucky. And this is an example of a project we did for the Forest Service. This was about 12 years ago now. We had some kids down who were on an alternative spring break, and they had one of these mortar hole sites on the Shawnee National Forest, and it had never been documented before. So we took these kids out there and they helped us map the site, photograph it, and record it so we know what is out there for the future if anything ever happens to it. And an interesting thing we found while we were doing it is we found other rock art images that no one had ever seen before. I think this one had a little human figure, an anthropomorph, carved next to one of the mortar holes that had never been seen before. And so this is something else you find out, is that a lot of our sites are so poorly documented that when you go back to them, you find things that people have never seen before. And why do we consider these sort of mortars to be spiritual? Why do we consider them to be rock art? Well, about that same time, there was a Native American elder who came down from Canada to be part of a conference at SIU. And he was Elder Roger Nagananosh of the Maganewan First Nation. And First Nation is their name for tribes in Canada. And so Roger is a spiritual leader, and he recognizes all these mortar holes as religious sites. He said, to my people, all these are religious sites. These are like where our ancestors or these spirits came down thousands of years ago and created these on the landscape. And so it makes you think about it in a different way. As an archaeologist, we just kind of think of them as, oh, this is where somebody was grinding grain a couple thousand years ago. And then you talk to somebody like Roger, who is a Native American religious leader, and he's saying, oh, no, these are religious sites. You've got, you have to be careful around them and careful what you do to them. The Archaic period gradually blends into the woodland period, and this is just a very gradual change. As people start learning about agriculture, they start growing plants that we consider to be weeds today, things like maygrass, goosefoot. They're actually cultivating those for food. And the big difference is they also start to learn how to make pottery, because now they're staying in one place longer and they're starting to make ceramic vessels. And you can't do that if you're trailing around all the time like they did in the Archaic period. So what it lets you know is that people are getting more sedentary, and we see rock art from this time period. And one of the things are human footprints. We also saw those in the Archaic period, but as a motif, they're continuing on into the woodland period. And we also see things like bird tracks. And these also occurred in the Archaic period, where you're seeing bird tracks. And again, is it really a bird? What is it that is making that sort of a track? And the reason we know that they occur in the woodland period, if you look at that bottom image, that is a design that was found on a ceramic jar that is about 2,000 years old up in the Illinois River Valley. And the scene that's being shown is a river. And if you look at the river, there are human footprints and bird tracks going along it. So that lets us know that this is evidence that these footprint and bird track image motifs go back 2,000 years in Illinois, and probably a lot before that. But again, in the Mississippian period is when we have an explosion of rock art. And the reason is because society has gotten very complex. This is our most populous period. We have a number of these big Mississippian towns, and again, some people identify Cahokia up by St. Louis as being actually a city. So these are very large urban centers. They've got a very complex religion. They have got priests. They've got rulers that are both have political power and religious power, kind of like if you think about the Pope in the Middle Ages, where the Pope, not only was he the leader of the Christian world initially, then he was the leader of Catholicism, but he also had military power. He also had soldiers. And so if you think about some of these Mississippian centers, the same thing is going on, where these leaders have both religious and political power. And so again, we see all of a sudden we start seeing designs. Religion is part of their life. It just permeates their life. And we see all sorts of religious symbols carved on like shell objects and copper objects. And again, a big one that they like is this cross and circle, where the circle is the universe and the cross is the 4 directions inside of it. But we also see things like giant birds, horned serpents, eye-like designs, and ceremonial axes, all carved on portable objects. But then when we go out to the landscape that they control, this stuff is also occurring out on the landscape. And so they are conducting rituals on the landscape, and they're making these same designs that you find on portable objects at their centers. And these are some examples. These are all from Southern Illinois. At the very lowest bottom right, you see a figure that is on copper. This is a beautiful figure. It's of a mythical being that has both falcon and human-like attributes. He's got wings. He wears an odd-shaped object for a headdress, and that is called the bilobed arrow. What those really are deer lungs. He is a mythical figure who actually, his myth actually survived into the historic period. He is known as Redhorn, and one of the myths about him is that he and his brother got into an argument one day while they were butchering a deer, and his brother got so mad at him that he took the deer lungs and he threw it, and he hit Redhorn in the chest with the deer lungs. And after that, Redhorn became as fast as a deer. And this is what they're conveying to you in that image. So when you see those deer lungs above it, you know that's Redhorn. And we go out to the landscape and we see that image. Those two little, at the far left, you see it, that is Redhorn again. It's a very simplified because they have to work in rock and a rock shoulder, but you can see the 2 lobes of the head, and you can see the feather coming out of the top of that figure. And you can see it's got a round bottom, which lets you know it's a bird again. And then up the upper top, we have these very famous copper plates that occur in the Mississippian period. They're only found over in Missouri. They're called the woofing plates. And it's of a double-headed falcon. Kind of like when you think of medieval Europe, like what the Habsburgs had and the Russians had, where they had a double-headed eagle. Well, this was a Mississippian image also. And we've got a rock art site in Southern Illinois, and it's the one at the top left, and it's badly vandalized. But if you look at that the white bird down there in the bottom right, you can see it's a double-headed falcon. So it's the same thing. We're seeing these myths and rituals being carried out on the landscape. So again, the point is this: what they're doing with creating rock art is not doodling, it's not graffiti, it has a religious purpose. And now I want to talk about some sites you can visit. And one of the sites I'm going to talk about is Piney Creek Nature Preserve. It's owned by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. It's on the Randolph-Jackson County line. It's northwest of Carbondale, where I work, by about 45 minutes. It is difficult to find. The reason being that if you look for it on Google, you'll get the wrong directions. And the state is not real interested in changing that. And part of the reason is it's a nature preserve, and they don't want a ton of people out there. If you know about it and you want to go out there, fine. But they don't encourage you by giving you correct directions or anything. Anyway, about 20 years ago, it is our largest rock art site in all of Illinois. It has hundreds of images in it. I told the state about 20 years ago, I said, you do know you own this. You do know you own the largest rock art site in the state. And they were, no, we didn't know that. And so they gave my department, or gave me, a grant to go in there and document all that rock art so that they would have a baseline. They would know what was there. And so if there's vandalism out there, if anything happens, they'll have a record of what is out there. And I actually wrote a book which you can buy online. If you go on to like Amazon, you enter Piney Creek, you'll bring it up. But anyway, we went there in 1997, 1998, and we saw images that people had never seen before. And again, it was the same thing. We spent over a year in there documenting it, and when you do that, you see things that people have never seen before. And the one, you can see that little canoe image that we discovered. It's the only canoe image in all of Illinois. Only one that has been found. I'm sure there are some other ones out there, but that is the first one. And before, let me figure out what year we're in. 24 years ago, no one even knew we had canoe images in Illinois until we found that one. And next to it, there is a painting of a figure that stands like this. And that is a pose called the shaman pose. He's telling you he is a religious image. And if you see him, it's hard to pick out. He actually has horns coming out of his head, which is a sign of spiritual power. And here we are. This is me and my crew there about 20 years ago, 24 years ago. At that time, the way you documented a big site like this, things are changing now. But at this time, the cutting edge was to go out there with acetate and trace all the designs one-to-one onto these big rolls of acetate. And that's what we're doing here. And if you look at it, where all the people are standing, that entire wall behind them is covered with images. But that big rock on the floor, that big boulder on the floor, also has hundreds of images on it. And you can see some of them that are here on these two maps. One of the things that's in there is the largest rock art image in Illinois. And this is of a figure that is almost 5 feet tall. We don't have anybody else as big as he is. We don't know who he is. There is no mythical figure in Native American religion for the eastern U.S. to say who this is. But he's holding 3 giant spears in his outstretched arms, and the arrows are pointing to the spears. Those sort of spear tips are 2,000 years old. So he may have been on that rock face for 2,000 years. A lot of the other rock art is more recent, but he may be one of the oldest images out there. And these are some of the small ones again, the ones we found. These are much later. These are probably all Mississippian paintings. And you can see they're all pretty much iron oxide where they're grinding up. You actually find the one on the upper left, you can actually see like an iron concretion in there. Well, they're taking those things and they're grinding them up into pigment and making a red paint that they can put on the rock face. And the images you see in here, there's a lot of vandalism at that site because it's been known since the late 1800s. But in the upper right, you can see that figure I showed you who was in the shaman position. And he is standing in the center of a group of about 5 deer. And somebody has vandalized a deer. The one on the left they've made look like a horse. The one on the right they've made look like a dog. But originally he stood in the center of a group of 5 deer as some sort of painting. Again, probably relating to a myth of some type or something they wanted to happen. Maybe it's related to hunting. We don't know. The bottom left, you see evidence of the sort of ritual activity they're doing. In this case, there is a deer painted, and it's got its tail in the back. Its tail is on the right, and it's hanging down. Its head is on the left, and it's hanging down. And its knees are buckled under it, like it's a deer that's dying. And what they did was they painted this on the rock face. Then they came back and killed it. If you look at the center of it, you can see the center of it is not painted anymore. And this is not modern vandalism. They themselves painted that image of a dying deer, and then they came back and they killed it as part of some sort of a ceremony. Now this is a figure that is really kind of cool that's up there. It's a human figure that's on the rock face. And again, he's holding a war club in one hand, and he's got a shield out in front of him in the other hand. And in the lower left, you see what he looks like. Somebody went up there around the turn of 1900, a Mr. Dudenbostel. And Mr. Dudenbostel didn't see him or he didn't care, and he painted his name right over him. The one thing that does let us know is that that painting has been on the rock face since at least 1900. And on the right, I removed the paint with just using Photoshop. And you can see, you get a better idea of what he looked like. And his left hand, he's holding out a rectangular shield in front of him. And in his right hand behind him, he's got his hand like this, and he's holding out a war club, like that club, that artifact that is pictured at the top. Oops, we can't go back to looking at that. At one time, I had in one of these images, I had lines that would show you that, but apparently not today. So now I wanted to kind of talk about some other things we've been doing with rock art. It's not just visiting these sites and going out and photographing them. A lot of new technology has come along. A lot of things are changing. It's actually kind of a really exciting time to be doing rock art. And one of the things that's come along is portable X-ray fluorescence pigment analysis. And that is a way that we can analyze the elemental composition of paintings without damaging them. And this is really important. If you think that these paintings are religious images, let's say like the Last Supper in Rome, you would never think about damaging the Last Supper by scraping off part of the pigment and analyzing it. But people were doing that routinely to rock art paintings, although we never did it in Illinois. But what this does is allow you to determine the elemental composition of these paintings without damaging them. And it is, and this at the you can see a man who's doing it. That's Dr. Jan Schimmick from the University of Tennessee, who's one of the top experts in the country. And we got Jan to come up and help us do portable X-ray fluorescent analysis. And the machine he's using sends an electromagnetic symbol out, and it'll tell you what the elemental composition of that painting is. And that's what you see on the graph right down at the bottom. And we have a computer screen, a computer with us when we're doing it. So right away we find out what the elements are in that painting. And I can guarantee you that graph is spiking up in the center. I guarantee that is iron ore. That is telling you there's a lot of iron in that painting. So this is really cool. This is the way we're finding out what's in these paintings without hurting them, without damaging them. And here we are again. This is at Piney Creek. We had documented in 1997, 1998. Again, as we get new technologies, we're going back out to these old sites and visiting them again. What we found out after analyzing about 20 paintings at different sites in southern Illinois, that iron is the primary ingredient, chromophore, in all the red paintings. But in two of the paintings, we also found sulfur and calcium. And that is important because that is a constituent of gypsum. And gypsum is something Native Americans prehistorically in the East were very interested in. They go miles underground into caves to get gypsum, but we never knew what they were doing with it. And now we're seeing paintings in the upper world that have gypsum in them. And so what are they up to? Well, this is what they're doing. This is how they get gypsum. If you were a Native American, you had to make, and if you think of caves as the underworld or the entrance of the underworld, this is very scary. This has to be a very dangerous thing they're doing. There actually have been miners found in Mammoth Cave, prehistoric Indians who died, who were killed, trying to get gypsum. And so they go down deep, maybe miles into these caves with torches, and they're after gypsum. And they come back up and they use that gypsum to help create paintings in the upper world. So it lets you know once again that this is not just doodling on the rock face. It's not just drawing. This is a dangerous spiritual enterprise they're involved with to try and get this ingredient so they can make these religious paintings in the upper world. And again, here's something else. This is Piney Creek again. When we initially mapped this back in 1997, 1998, it took us weeks, months to trace all the designs out there onto acetate. And now this is a woman I work with at SIU, Kaylee Sharp, and she's into photogrammetry. And with photogrammetry, she can take a series of photographs of this rock, which is covered with hundreds of petroglyphs. And she can do it in a matter of minutes or an hour. And then we can take it back and we can digitally stitch all those photographs together. And very rapidly, we get this. This is it. So within a matter of hours, she did what years ago took us days or weeks to accomplish. And the cool thing about what she's doing is these images, you can take them and you can manipulate them on the computer. I can't do that today, but you can actually turn these things around, or you can turn the light at a different angle so it will bring out some images that maybe you can't see at a different angle. So it's an interactive way to actually look at these rock art sites. And it's a way you can do it in a laboratory too, or in your office. And here's an example again. When you look at what she's got there, you can see these kind of meandering lines going there, and those are serpents. There are lots of snakes on this rock. There is even a horned serpent on this rock. So again, This is, and you'll see let's see. There it is at the top. I don't know if it's on this one or not. I guess it is. You can see the top image is what we drew on hand 20 years ago. And the really cool thing about, or the really good thing, gratifying to me, is that our maps from 20 years ago match about 99% with the photogrammetric maps, which I'm glad we did it right. Another new technique that's come along is something called de-stretch. And you can actually, let's see if I've got my phone here. You can actually get de-stretch as an app for your phone. And, or you can get it for your desktop computer. And what it is, it's a photo application. And it's now used by rock art researchers all over the world. People in Europe use it, people in Africa use it, people in Australia use it. And what it does is you take a photograph of a painting and it very quickly puts it through all different sorts of color values. And so you may be looking at a painting and you're not sure if it's there, you can't figure it out, and you put it into de-stretch, and de-stretch will, depending on what you enter, will emphasize different colors. And here's an example from Piney Creek at the bottom. If you look at the left, you can barely see that image. It's of the two figures, the one with the shield and the bowman. And you look at it in de-stretch, all of a sudden you can see it a lot clearer. And again, at the far right, there it is again. And for the cost of the app, it costs a lot more for to get it on your desktop, but to do it for this, it's only like $10 to get it on your phone. And so I now take my phone out with me when I'm analyzing rock art, and I photograph it, and I can instantly look at an image on my phone doing that. So this is pretty amazing. This is going to show you a little example of this. This is one of the reasons why we protect sites or try to keep their locations restricted. I don't take people to sites on private land because, for one thing, I don't like taking anyone onto private land without the landowner's permission. But this is an example of a site that I initially documented in 1998. And again, it had little painted images, and they're in the upper left. And it's a terribly looted rock shelter, terribly torn up. And we went out there about 5 years ago. It shows you what it looked like in 1998. And there are those little images at the bottom. Again, there's a figure in a shaman pose with his arms up like this. And we went out there in 2015, 2016. Those images are gone. Somebody cut them out in the last 8 years. The only place they now survive are in my photographs from 1998. But luckily, they missed part of an image. They didn't see one of the images because it was so faded. And we were able to bring it out with de-stretch. And so we were able to use both PXRF and de-stretch to analyze that last remaining image. And at the bottom you can see there's like an inset where a block is missing. That's where those two images were that were cut out. No idea who did this. It's really stupid to do something like this. I'm almost willing to bet they destroyed it trying to get it out. And so here we are. Kaylee's got the PXRF instrument. She is analyzing the last remaining painting that's out there, and it revealed that it was made out of iron ore, similar to other paintings in southern Illinois. And then this is it in de-stretch. And if you look at it at the far left, all you can see is like that little arm waving at you. And this is why they never bothered to cut this image out. But when we put it into de-stretch, you can see it's a human, an anthropomorph again. And he's got two arms, one that's out like this, and he's got one down like this, like he's bowling. And he's got a round object at the end of his arm. And you can see his body, and he's got little legs. And what he is this. This enabled us to date this painting. It's a Mississippian image. And here is this same figure carved on shell and on a statue. And again, the figure is holding this disc in his hand, which is called a discoidal. And this was a very important element of Mississippian religion. And they're portraying, again, maybe a mythical figure who plays this game. And they portray him holding this stone disc in his hand. And this game persisted into the 1800s among Plains group. And when George Catlin went out on the plains, he actually photographed Indians, or he drew painted Indians, and you see them down in the bottom. They're playing this same game with discoidals. And you would roll it along the ground, and you would throw your spear where you thought it was going to end up, and whoever got the closest won. But the importance of it is we now know that this is a figure who's playing this game called Chunky, and he's got a discoidal in his hand. We know where he dates to. And we wouldn't have been able to figure him out if we didn't have both PXRF and D-stretch to make him appear better than he was. This is another site you can go visit. Now, I show like 3 sites that you can go visit. This one is on the Shawnee National Forest. It's Buffalo Rock in Johnson County. It is our only painting of a buffalo in all of Illinois. Buffalo came into the state relatively late. Into southern Illinois, they came into relatively late. They weren't really here till 1700. So the fact that we have a buffalo painted on the rock means that this must be a historic period Native American site, that it must date to around 1700 or later. And there are Native American hunters who are down in southern Illinois at that time, hide hunting for the French. So they may have done that. Another thing we found out, and again, this gets back to how poorly documented a lot of our rock art sites are. We were out there doing work, documenting the bison, and we went and looked in the overhang at the right where it's darker, and we found 2 other images. We found a moon and a star that no one had ever seen before. And I've since had a number of people tell me, you know, there's a moon and a star out there, and I found it. And it's like, no, you didn't, I found it. And you've gone to one of my talks and you think you found it, but you didn't. So, but it was us. It's just, to me, it's just amazing that what's at these sites, that they're so poorly documented, and you go back out and you see all this stuff. And this is what I wanted to talk about vandalism again. This is why we protect sites. This is why we have a couple of sites that we'd like people to go to, and we have a number of other sites that have to be protected by concealing their locations. This happened at Buffalo Rock. Buffalo Rock is open to the public. But we went out there in 2010 and somebody had just done graffiti all over it. And what they're doing is, luckily for us, they did it with charcoal. And they wrote, "We were meant to eat each other," all over it. Well, that turns out that's from a post-heavy metal album called Art Damage. So some people were out there, some hikers were out there, or campers, or vandals, and they had been inspired by this song on the album Art Damage, and they decided, we're going to damage some art. So they went out there and they damaged this thing. And so we had to go back out there the following year in 2011, and we restored it. And we were able to get all that charcoal off the rock face without damaging the painting. And the way we did it was you took distilled water and sponges, and you can see that Heather, who is a Forest Service archaeologist on the right with the blonde hair, she is spraying the charcoal and she's catching it on a sponge. You don't want to put it on, you don't want to spray the water on the sponge and try and rub that charcoal off, because all you do is smear it and make a big mess. So what we were doing was dissolving the charcoal, catching it on the sponges, and then wringing the sponges out and doing it over and over again until we got everything off. And now this site is back to looking like it does in the lower left. So when you go out there and look at these sites like this, one thing I like to get across to people is that people are actively watching these sites, and we're actively trying to protect them. And if we see damage, we will restore it. And that's what happened with this one. Now another site, this is another site that you can go visit, and this is about the last one I'm going to really talk about. This is owned by the Shawnee National Forest also, and it's over in Pope County. It is a big Mississippian period site. You can go visit it. It has interpretive walkways, and it's got 3 sets of rock art. And it is an amazing site. Right down here by Paducah, across the river, there was a large Mississippian center called the Kincaid site. Similar to the Cahokia site, it was a very large center. You can see a picture of it. It had a wall, I think it's on the flood wall down here in Paducah, but it had a wall around it, had all sorts of structures inside of it. It started breaking apart around 1350 AD, and we don't know why it broke apart. It may be that they were having a civil war, it may be that they exhausted all their food. but groups start breaking off. Families and clans start breaking off and going to other areas. And one of them went about 45 miles inland, and they arrived at Millstone Bluff. And they created a smaller chiefdom, very much smaller than Kincaid. But they arrived there with like their religious beliefs still intact, and their political hierarchy still intact. And they're recreating the Kincaid site on a much smaller scale when they got to Millstone Bluff. And this is the bluff itself. And when you look at it in the upper left, and this is what some people have pointed out, it looks like a mound. It looks like a Native American mound. And that may be what attracted them to that bluff top. Anyway, when they got up there, they erected a village on the very top. You can't see it on that map over there, but it has numerous house depressions. And this is the best time to go see Millstone right now. Late winter, early spring, because the vegetation is down and you can see all the houses where they were. But one of the other things that they did was they created 3 sets of rock art. And they probably did these at the very beginning when they arrived up there. And you see them there in the image at the right. They're the 3 panels. The one on the right is all birds. It's all upper world images. The one in the center is a combination of birds at the top and serpents at the bottom. And the one on the left is all serpents. What they're doing is they're laying their religion for you out on the rock face. This is all planned. And again, once again, it gets into this is not doodling. This is a religious site. They are telling you their view of the universe, with the upper world in the east and the underworld in the west. And the way we realized that was about 20 years ago. We went out there and we were mapping. This group had never been really documented adequately, even though it was owned by the government. And so we went out there about 20 years ago. I went out with my wife, who's a Forest Service archaeologist, and we mapped the eastern group where the giant birds were. And when we did that, we found out there was a hidden pattern inside that group. And it's a repeating pattern of a giant falcon, a human-like figure with one arm up and one arm down, and this kind of odd thing at the bottom, which, as it turns out, is a bilobed arrow. And this is what they're doing. They're trying to get across this idea of Redhorn, who is this mythical figure who's got falcon attributes, and he's got a bilobed arrow headdress. He's part bird and he's part human. And if you explode him out and look at these 3 elements, there is the falcon, the human part, and the bilobed arrow. That's who they're portraying on the rock art. And he's too difficult to carve, so they're laying out his attributes for you. Any Mississippian person who came there 1,000 years ago would have looked at those and they'd immediately have known who that was. This is similar like if you go to a Christian church or Catholic church, and we have symbols like a lamb. And the lamb can symbolize Jesus. It's the Lamb of God. It's not a lamb. It's something that stands for Jesus. And they're doing the same thing there at this site. And as soon as we saw that there was a pattern in the East group, it immediately became clear to us, we had never thought about it before, that the West is all snakes, including this elk antlered rattlesnake down at the bottom. So it's got all underworld creatures, no birds at all in the Western group. So it's the upper world on the one side and the underworld on the other side. And this is what they're doing. They're laying this giant cross and circle out over their site. And they're showing you the upper worlds in the east, the underworlds in the bottom, and in the middle group, they repeat that, the upper world at the top and the underworld at the bottom. So they're telling you, either they're projecting their view of the universe over their site, or they're telling you that their site is the center of this religious universe. So it's pretty cool, and this is the only site in the eastern U.S. where we have been able to see this sort of pattern going on. And very quickly, I'm going to end up by showing you one last thing, and that relates to the solstice. Not the solstice, I'm sorry, to the eclipse. In 2017, we had an eclipse here, and Carbondale was at the center of it, but it covered a much larger area. Carbondale was the largest duration. But we see these images in Mississippian art, these circles, and especially the one in the center, There seems things are projecting out. And there was this archaeologist in Missouri who said, you know what? I'm willing to bet that some of those things are eclipse images. And that's where these things are coming from. And so then they get in this, and if you were a Native American and you saw the sun get blotted out, it would have been a profound religious experience. And so this sort of imagery gets into Mississippian art. And I and other people were all kind of like, well, that's nice. You know, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Anyway, we had a big event down at Carbondale in 2017. And again, it came right over top of us. And especially if you look at the image of total darkness, and you can see how the light is projecting out. That is what he is talking about. And this is how it appeared over top of the football stadium in Carbondale. But I went out to a winery, which actually turned out to be much nicer because the football stadium got clouded over. And we saw it. These are images we took. And all of a sudden, I could see what he was talking about at this point where the sun is completely being blocked out and you see these rays projecting outside of it. And all of a sudden it was like, I think he's onto something. I think he is correct that this is where this is coming from. And we're going to get another chance to try it out again because in 2024 we're going to have another total eclipse. So if you want to see this phenomena, and if you want to see it for yourself, get some glasses and go somewhere, hopefully where the clouds won't be, and take a look at it and see what you think. And finally, that's all I have to say, except this is an image I like to use to embarrass my daughter, who is now 26 years old. And she still gets embarrassed. I heard about this last night. But this is her when she was a little kid. And we went to look at a rock shelter in southern Illinois where somebody had said they'd seen some rock art. And it turned out it wasn't. It was all modern stuff. But what was going on is that there was a pool of iron ore because of the waterfall. It had created kind of like an iron ore slurry there. And she went and put her hands in it. And then she put her hands on the rock face. And just like that, she had these handprints up there. And so I'm not going to tell you where this is. The point is, don't do this. This is bad. Someday somebody's going to report this site to me, and I'm going to have to go out there and say, yeah, I know who did that. I know exactly where, we shouldn't have done it. So anyway, it's kind of like leave well enough alone. Don't create your own rock art. Creating your own rock art is very, very offensive to Native Americans. We do have sites down here in southern Illinois where people go to, and they hold ceremonies, New Age ceremonies or whatever, and they create their own rock art. And Native Americans are not amused by that at all. It's like going into a church and then adding, scribbling on the walls or something. That's about the way they view it. It's like, this is our religion. Who told you you could go in here and do this sort of thing? So anyway, thank you.